Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to continue on with the horse eye tutorial. So the part 1 I posted last week. The link to that and the reference as well as the playlist will be in the description box down below, as well as the drawing size and the grid size. So part 1 we did the time-lapse version will be the tutorial, and there will also be the part 1 long version. So I've already posted the part 2 long version. That will also be in the playlist, and I'll also link that down below. So in this part we will be covering the start of the tack as well as those initial kind of starting points of the middle values of the fur. So with all my drawings, I start the tack in a similar manner by mapping out the most defining shadow or the darker areas first. So I generally use my F pencil for that, and I apply it with light pressure. So light pressure to me is kind of my go-to pressure. I very rarely, unless I really want to put in those darker values, use a harder pressure. So the leather in this reference is quite smooth and blurred out at the top, and as you go lower down it will become more in focus. So I think this leather is quite a good learning tool if you want to learn how to blend and kind of build up those punchy contrasts with that blended look. So with leather, and it will be like this for materials that are similar to leather, you will build the depth a lot quicker than the areas like the fur and the eye. So I continuously still work in smaller sections, but that initial start with the F pencil you can apply to your full leather kind of section of the drawing, and then after that I'll just add a wash of powder. So the same method of defining the darker areas with the pencil, blending it out or adding the powder, and following it up with defining the lighter areas with a mono eraser will be applied to these sections as well. So it's a very similar starting point to what I covered in part 1 for the eye and those initial outside layers of the fur. So everything is cut and dry, the same starting point. So I'll also use a blending stump with powder, especially in these smaller sections where I can be a bit more controlled. And I just want to use that to define those kind of middle ground values within the leather itself, which just helps to define the shape. So I will also use a 2H in the lighter areas, which is not where I applied the powder with the blending stump. Just after that will also be a soft layer of powder. So it's those initial steps. So the F pencil is to define the darker areas, use a blending stump to help facilitate that as well and do it a bit quicker, and also it gives a smoother, softer result. And the 2H is just for those areas where you will have your most highlighted sections. So the areas kind of adjacent to where you would have defined with the mono eraser. So I've already kind of touched on the lighter pressure, so I will use that when applying most of my pencil layers, or if not all of them, as I kind of use it in a way to slowly build up areas as well as to keep that seamless blend between your darker and lighter areas. So I've only kind of been able to achieve that by using the lighter pressure and building up the depth slowly and continuously by blending into these areas that are lighter with every area. It does mean that you will be constantly adding pencil and taking it away, as well as constantly adding powder and kind of taking it away. But I have achieved my most kind of desired results with this method, so I just continue using it. And you can play around with it if you like the quicker method and found a quicker way to do it, then by all means go for it, especially if it applies more to your style, and your style obviously differs slightly from mine. So far I've kind of kept to my normal range of pencils. I started with the F, also used an HB and a 2H. I've also used a B pencil for some of the darker areas, and that will kind of be my foundation pencils for the most part when starting out those initial layers. I can use the HB and the B to help me to define the darker areas. Obviously they'll look dark in the beginning, so for initial layers you won't have a lot of that middle range values that actually carry the drawing and make those really dark parts really dark and the really light parts really light. So in those initial stages, in the initial layers as well, you can very easily see kind of the end result, but just at a lighter point or stage. And that's why I like to define the shadow areas first, because it gives you kind of that satisfaction of seeing the shape and the drawing come together, and also kind of see whether you are achieving or kind of on the right path to getting what you want and the desired results. And once you start adding in those highlights with the mono eraser and continuously adding them as you layer along, the picture starts to become clearer, and you can kind of start planning out whether or not you want to change something here, maybe go darker or lighter in other areas than you would normally. And that just gives you the opportunity to kind of see whether or not you want to change a bit direction, you want to maybe go a bit more heavily contrasted in this area, which is different from the reference, maybe focus on something else as well. So these initial layers I also kind of use as a planning stage to see whether or not I'm kind of vibing with what I'm doing, or if I want to maybe change course. So I did mention that I have that kind of standard close range, but I've also used the 6B in a similar manner to the F pencil in the tack closest to the eye. So I will use that 6B for the defining darker areas, but I will also obviously use it in a very light pressure, not really wanting to actually add solid depth, so there will be a lot of the paper and the grain peeking through, and for that I will actually use one of my pencils to blend it out. So the F pencil or the HB, you can choose either one. I sometimes even go lower than that and go for a 2H or an H, and that's just another way to blend out certain areas. It's also a very quick way, like in 2 layers, to build up a darker kind of value or depth. So the reason I also sometimes do this, it's not a general rule that I follow, but it just depends on kind of, it's a subconscious thing where I just pick pencils for certain areas and not sometimes follow my own rules. So the 6B blended out with an F or an HB in that manner, it builds the depth up very quickly, but because I use soft pressure for both layers, I can easily still blend it out into kind of everything that's surrounding it, as well as still be able to erase it if I've maybe gone too far or made the area too large or gone into a space where I wasn't supposed to or got the shape wrong. So I do sometimes do that as well, and the leather is one of the prime examples of a texture where I will sometimes just go straight in with a really dark or higher range B pencil and use a low range pencil to blend it out. So the initial layers, like I've mentioned, is very similar to everything else that I do, but this is where I'm kind of going to differ from how I approach it in terms of the contrast and the foundation and how I want the end result to look in comparison to the fur and the eye. So the leather, if you've looked at the reference, you would notice that both the leather and the fur is quite contrasted, and I've already mentioned in part 1 that I will not be following the reference as much for the fur, and that for the leather in this case I actually want to kind of keep that look of the very light layers at the top where it's very contrasted in the light, and then the very dark highly contrasted areas lower down. So with the fur, I want that contrast but I want the deeper foundation layer than what is in the reference. So I'll basically use the top layer to kind of show the contrast. The final detail layer for the fur will be the contrast, but I want a deeper layer to really kind of show that depth and really hone in the real like fur. It's got substance to it. So for the tack, for the most part, it doesn't really have texture. We've done a leather tutorial where we've had pieces of the leather where it was very textured, with very weathered, where you kind of do want then to have that deeper foundation layer, as I mentioned I want for the fur. So then I will use the top layer, the detail layer, to emphasize the contrast and not start that emphasis on the contrast in the foundation layers, so that that contrast from the details really stands out and actually makes sense and kind of gives that punch and real weathered look, because it's the weathered look in the fur, not in the fur, in the leather, as well as the fur, you get those very sharp edge highlights, and that really stands out more when you have a deeper foundation layer. So for this leather, it's, like I mentioned, not very textured, it's quite smooth, and therefore I don't need to worry about having to put a texture over top, so I can actually just, stay true to reference, have those lighter areas be just a wash of powder, addition of 2H, maybe add a little bit of HB or F here and there for the deeper sections, and then build it up from there and have the darker areas down below. And that's kind of how you have to approach different areas of texture and kind of decide, okay, this is a heavily textured area. I need to approach my foundation layers slightly differently from the start, kind of from those layers in between those middle layers, in comparison to an area where it's not heavily textured. It's either smooth like the metal in this case, also same principle. You can kind of go in a few layers and be one and done with it. So you don't need to pay as much attention or take as much care to build those foundation layers up to a point where your textures will really stand out, make sense, be realistic, and have those punchy contrasts, like in this case, where you want that real definition of light and dark. So touching on the metal, especially the highlights in the metal as well as around the holes in the leather, I will define them for every layer. So those are one of those things that just needs to keep on being put in with every layer as you go. You blend over top of it and then you just add it in again. So I mentioned kind of my reasoning for this in part one, and it's mainly to keep the highlights in the realm of the values of what it surrounds, so that it makes sense and it's not just some random stark white area in the middle of just grays. And yeah, you need it to make sense with whatever goes around it. It must not stand out and draw the eye, because you don't want that. You kind of want to draw the viewer to the central point, which is the eye for this drawing, and which I want to keep it that way. So you don't want to draw the eye elsewhere with some strange highlight or shadow or mark. So the metal has these kind of tiny highlights that add to the realism and the shape. So just above the piece that goes through the hole in the leather, there is immediate highlight followed by a shadow. So these are kind of those small little details that are fun to add and are really important to the overall look of the drawing. So once all the final values are complete, they won't draw the eye like I mentioned, but they will kind of add to that illusion of realism, because it just adds that little touch of care, and it really shows that you understand how certain materials interact with light and how light bounces off of them and reflects off of them. So now we've kind of done those initial layers for the leather. So the leather kind of progresses a lot quicker than the fur. So now we're moving on to the fur, and I will start initially out with the largest section, just kind of continuing adding the depth to the contours around the eye, and also adding depth with pencil. I think I used the B pencil, and then a layer of powder. So after that, you should probably know what's going to happen. Use a mono eraser, and I start to roughly define the texture as well as to map out larger sections of the high points of the face. So you kind of just do the opposite of what you would do with a pencil and the powder. For the contours and the depth and kind of the dark areas, you do the exact same with the mono eraser. You can also use the kneaded eraser. I think I used the kneaded eraser in the leather at some point. You can very easily also use that in those initial layers for the fur. So I will use a B pencil and a HB kind of interchangeably, and somewhere along the lines, once I start to really start working in smaller section, I will use a 2H and a 2B as well. So very much still my standard range of kind of those starting pencils for the initial layers. I continue using them until kind of those middle points, middle layers, where you will start defining the texture even more. So you would also have noticed that I do use different types of brushes as well. In part one, I used the smaller long bristle brush, and also used a very large long bristle brush. So I have two very soft long bristle brushes and one denser one with a shorter bristle. So I like to use all three of them are actually pre-purpose makeup brushes, which I think works perfectly. The cheap ones you can just pick up and they're soft and they just work fantastic. Even the smaller, longer brush that I use are just paint brushes, but obviously the softer synthetic ones, just for a smaller point and just more of a very precise application for certain areas. So the one with the longer, less compact bristles, that I will use generally mostly for all of my kind of powder layers, and that's just a very soft and light application. Obviously your blending stumps will be your most denser, very concentrated application, and the softer bristle brush is just a lighter, it's more of a soft addition, just a wash of powder. So the second one is actually one that I cut shorter to where the length will be when it starts to get more dense, and this is just another way to apply a more heavier application of powder, and it will just add a slightly deeper section to it. So that's kind of, I very rarely use it. It's also smaller, so I use it in smaller section, not for larger areas. If I just want to add, I don't want a light application of powder, I just want that quick little addition of depth without using the blending stump, because I don't want that more concentrated application. I just want a larger, quicker kind of just layer of depth that I can go over top with a pencil or just straight in with a mono eraser to start defining kind of areas within that are lighter or darker. And that's just a quick way to also build layers and contours. So we're kind of nearing the end of this part of the tutorial, and it's also where I start to work in smaller sections for the fur. So I will start doing this once I get to those middle values, and I really need to start focusing on the textures and building up those foundation layers for those final textures. So I've mentioned my small range 2H, HB, 2B, and the mono eraser, as well as the blending stump and the long bristle brush. I will sometimes throw in a 2H or an H in there somewhere. The 2B is just to start defining those darker sections that I need to, it's not a big jump from the HB, it's still very soft application, a very light application. I don't want to just go in and start adding deep lines. I want to continuously build up, and that's just to build up the depth and so forth. So we will, in part 3, obviously continue this whole middle layer section of the fur, but that will be quite a substantial part of the drawing, because it does take some time because of my slow and go method. But anyways, I hope you enjoy this part, and I'll see you all for the next one. Cheers!